But I am pleased to introduce our presenter for this series, Scott Holter. He's the director of Meaden Moore Business Solutions. Scott has spent more than 20 years in manufacturing and technology consulting, working with manufacturers of all types and sizes. He has extensive experience with multiple software applications, not only assisting clients with evaluating and selecting software, but also improving the utilization of existing software. Through the dozens of projects he's led, he has reviewed, evaluated, and audited more than 80 different enterprise software products. He authored and presented a paper called Synergy, ERP and Lean to NIST MEP, which is the national network that centers like the NWIRC are part of. Since then, Scott has helped several companies craft and realize a vision for simplifying and melding their ERP software and lean manufacturing initiatives. Prior to joining Meaden Moore, Scott spent 12 years in manufacturing operations, holding several different positions. He has a wealth of knowledge. I'm glad to have him here with us today and on our second session coming up to share that information with us. So without further ado, Scott, you now have the floor.
Great. Thank you, Molly. And thank you to everyone for attending. I see we've got about 15 participants, so I really appreciate the audience. And I will do my best to make this presentation as entertaining as possible and not a death by PowerPoint. So please feel free to use the chat box to interject questions or at least talk amongst yourselves if groups of you are together. This is a two-part series. So if we run a little long today, I'll make it up on the back end. If we get ahead of things, we'll move it ahead. But I think we've got a good amount of time where we can do some Q&A at the end of both sessions. So at least for today, I want to talk about just a market survey of levels of satisfaction with enterprise software. And for today's purposes, just to keep for brevity, I'll use the acronym ERP, but I want everybody to please understand that enveloped in that is CRM software or point solutions like asset management, accounting software, scheduling software, CRM, all of those we would encompass. I just don't want to repeat that mouthful of jargon every time. We'll look at some of the reasons that systems fail to deliver on their promises, maybe go through the enterprise software life cycle. And once we've set that foundation of discussion, we'll talk about what we call fit and utilization gaps and what are they and how you can find them, what some of the symptoms and how you can measure them, and then ultimately solve some of those. And once we've talked about those, and those tend to be the operational and tactical things that companies face on a day-to-day basis, we'll also talk about bigger picture structural and technological gaps that bring different symptoms and different solutions. And then maybe we'll end today's sessions with some trends and opportunities that we're seeing in modern systems, some of which you folks may be experiencing if you're using modern systems, some of which you may be pining for if your company's perhaps using decades old software. And then in our part two, what we'll do is we'll start working on how to build a roadmap for improved utilization and overall improved satisfaction with your software, starting with making sure that its strategy is aligned with your business's strategy. And then we'll get into some process design considerations. We'll look at then detailed requirements that the software must fulfill functionally and technologically, and how you measure the fit and utilization of your software. We'll get into some cost and budgetary considerations. It's easy to dream big when you're unconstrained by budget, but especially in these times, we realize that budgetary constraints must come in. And then, before we get into making it happen and some of the techniques for realizing the gains, we'll take a moment to talk about some of the paradoxes that we see in technology and compensation related to enterprise software. So we've pulled this from a number of different sources, including some of our own client base. And what we've learned over the years is that just about half of companies report being fairly or very satisfied with their ERP software, which leaves close to half, 43%, claiming that they're very dissatisfied, fairly dissatisfied, or neutral. And if you look at it, even neutral is a bad report card for something that is the largest technology expenditure for a manufacturer or a distributor. Of that 43%, 40 to 70%, depending on your source, ultimately scuttle the project and never get implemented, which is at that point, that is a true waste of dollars, both the dollars out the door as well as the time. But even for those that do get implemented, 53% went over budget on the initial implementation, 60% went over the planned project timeline. Oftentimes, if you go over time, you tend to go over budget, but 60% delivered less than expected benefits. And therein is probably the theme that we're going to be focusing on today and in 2 weeks is what can we do to not be part of that 60%, but to be part of the 40% that got what we expected out of our investment. One thing to do is to look at and just maybe self-exercise for you and your company is to spot yourself, where are you on the life cycle of enterprise software? Most companies go through this life cycle where they select a package, they'll roll it out and be gaining value. Over time, maybe they won't be accelerating the gain, but they'll still be improving the use of their software and embedding it more in the company. And hopefully for a long period, you'll go into a period where you're retaining value or maybe improving at a fairly slow rate, but it's keeping up with the demands and fulfilling the needs of your company. But ultimately, some things happen. It doesn't happen in all cases. Sometimes that maintenance period can be 20, 30 years. Other times we've seen it as short as 3 to 5 years, but a moment will come and you'll realize that you're losing value and that the system relative to its demands is decaying. And we don't mean that from a standpoint of it's running slow or, what have you, but it's failing to meet the needs of the company. And so at that point, companies will come into a retirement planning mode. Now, the retirement planning may ultimately yield an upgrade, but more often, and that's more often the case, but sometimes the upgrade becomes unpalatable or there's some experiences that occurred and it may necessitate a replacement. Either way, we recommend that be done by a requirements analysis and definition. So that's where, it would be good for all of you as kind of a takeaway to, look at where you are on this life cycle and be able to pinpoint how far you are from that retirement planning exercise. In that life cycle, generally speaking, the primary big picture and big dollar issues will be whether we maintain what we've got, upgrade what we've got, or replace what we've got. And often that is based on any sort of assessment of performance gaps. Does the system or systems, if it's a cohort of systems, lack the features that we need? Or do we need new features? It may be lacking them, or maybe we just need to add some new ones that we didn't purchase. But more often than not, it's more from a standpoint of, are we underutilizing or misutilizing features that are readily available? As a consultant who gets, chartered with uncovering these, here's some of the symptoms that we tend to look for. We look for people executing workarounds. We look for processes that are executing workarounds. And Excel and Outlook are two of the biggest culprits that we'll find. Silo systems that have been invented, added, or what have you, that solve a narrow problem, but maybe don't create a global optimum. And so generally speaking, these are things we will see, but generally what we'll hear is we're not productive, we're not efficient. It takes us too much time or effort to do things like deliver a quote, or perhaps our customers are complaining about delivery lead times, fill rates, things like that. So this is what we tend to hear, and these are the things that we'll tend to observe. So why is this? Well, over time, and it's very subtle, sometimes there are big, huge step changes, but often it's subtle over time that the business's demands change. and that causes the software supporting requirements to change, and that creates gaps. The big five that we see are these five up here in the upper right. Our business model changed. That crazy CEO in the corner office decided to get into new things that we hadn't anticipated when we bought and implemented the system 5 years ago. Or that we institute process changes. We want to do things differently, whether it's how we bring product in the door, how we distribute product out the door, how we manufacture products in between, whatever, but we change our processes. Sometimes it's that office factory, if you will, that's creating paperwork or transactions where the processes change. In other cases, we see customers' demands changing, and those demands impose changes on the supporting software. I get some of my best one-liners from our clients, and one meeting we were working with a client, and several employees were lamenting their customers, and I don't know I think it was the CEO, but it might have been the VP of sales. He said, if it wasn't for all those darn customers, we could actually get some work done. And obviously very sarcastic. But so the point of it is, it's hard to say no to customers, but we have to be cognizant of what those yes responses mean to our systems and procedures. Less frequently, we'll run into regulatory changes. Not uncommon, but in our market, which tends to be small and mid-sized companies, we're not seeing as much, say, SEC or public company type things that you see in the big companies. One of the biggest ones we've seen in recent years is the impact of departing employees. That can create some real problems that manifest themselves in gaps. And we'll talk about that in a bit. The other five here tend to be more easily solved and less common, and not things that we tend to get a lot of involvement in, other than when companies get to a point where they say, hey, we are so overly customized, or our vendor went out of business or got acquired and the software is no longer supported. We've got to move along. And in that case, there's not a lot of options for us to recommend other than moving to a new system. So let's talk about some examples, and maybe, because this is not, so much an interactive, but I'd love to see if you guys can come up with some cases for yourselves where your business model or process changes impacted your enterprise software. Again, be it ERP, maybe it impacted just a module within your system, or your customer relationship management. These are some examples from our clients list over the last decade, where someone who had strictly been doing assembling bought and backward integrated in an injection molding business. And all of a sudden they're dealing with things like tracking regrind and co-products because they've got molds that make 3 or 4 parts at the same time. Distributors acquiring a manufacturing business where they had good distribution software, but lousy or no manufacturing software. A job shop contract manufacturer launched its own product line. This company had to now start dealing with engineering change control on their own rather than responding to the OEM's engineering changes. A capital equipment manufacturer that we worked with decided that they didn't want to pay third-party technicians to service their equipment in the field at their customers, but instead decided to hire somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 field service technicians over time and develop a service business. Had a huge impact on their business software, and ultimately, after about 3 years, led to a replacement. A domestic manufacturer expanded overseas, bringing all kinds of currency and regionalization requirements. And then in one of my favorites, a large multinational metal processor decided to get creative, diversify, and bought 5 small emerging electronics companies around the world. So they went from domestic to global. They went from a metal-based company to an electronics tech company, and found that their ERP system, initially, as it had been rolled out, needed to be reconstructed. Not a replacement, but a re-implementation of it in the new company. So hope some of those ring true for you folks, and be happy to hear some of your war stories when we get to the Q&A. those darn customers can often have an impact as well. One of our clients who had long been fighting doing electronic data interchange, EDI, finally threw in the towel and implemented EDI after years of foregoing it, just because they've been adding more retailers to their customer base. I'm guessing many of you have, just looking at the attendee list, have dealt with things like stocking agreements that customers impose on you, or customer-specific containerization, palletization, labeling, or customers who, if you're old enough to remember the Burger King jingle of "have it your way, special orders don't upset us" kind of thing. Some customers require their own formatted shipping documents or invoices and what have you. Customers these days are demanding things like certificates of analysis and conformance, advanced ship notices, traceability proof, maybe even some KPIs, some scorecards where you scorecard yourself, or other just kind of industry specific compliance that we've specifically seen in medical, aerospace, and automotive, be it 8D, CAPA reporting, all of those kind of things. So the point of it is, those darn customers can really impose some requirements, and many of those requirements end up being fulfilled by the product design and the product delivery, but many others end up having to be fulfilled by the enterprise software system that might not natively do what they're asking for out of the box, or, as we've experienced, sometimes the person who's involved in making the promises to the sales, to the customer, doesn't know and has to ask. So I don't want to underestimate the impact of the regulatory environment, but we don't see it as common as customers, but we do see where regulations imposed by various government and non-government agencies will cause impact among our small and mid-sized manufacturing client base, be it AIAG automotive labeling, FDA compliance with the CGMP, multi-language labels and documents for shipment into Quebec, for example. So they can be strenuous. The one that we've seen most common in the last 3 years has been sales tax compliance, as just companies have been shipping products that maybe prior weren't required, but now are required to charge and collect sales tax. This one is probably worth spending some time on, and that is the impact of employee turnover and loss of that institutional knowledge. Perhaps your system or systems were successfully and fully implemented initially. People were well educated, well trained, it was well implemented. You're not among that group that said we didn't get the loss, but people move on. Maybe business conditions changed and you let them go, or they left on their own volition. But either way, what they knew as power users maybe doesn't get fully translated to those that come behind them and replace them. We estimate that somewhere in the neighborhood of in a good case, the replacement gets 70 to 80% of what that initial power user might have received in terms of education and training on the systems, procedures, and whatnot. Well, if you go 2 to 3 generations, and if each person has a 20 to 30% yield loss, air quotes, of institutional knowledge, by the time you're down to the second or third replacement, you're down to maybe that person only getting 30% of what the original person received in know-how. And so the company loses that expertise, and with it become that the people end up making up things as they go along. They fill the gaps with on their own, maybe with Excel, because there isn't really that vehicle for that person, like the original implementation, to sit down and spend time designing processes. So how does this manifest itself? And these are things that we tend to look for or get told outright when we work with clients or hear from them. Oftentimes the focus was on the transaction processing, and the decision support tools might not have been fully implemented. And as we say, that's necessary, not sufficient. oftentimes we'll hear, well, we implemented it as an accounting system. As me working for an accounting firm, I have to be careful not to bash that phraseology, but it is somewhat derogatory if we take a look and see why. These things all here, we want to do well, we want to do expediently, efficiently, because they are transaction layer processing, and that is one element of what ERP is. But when you look at what the amalgamation of ERP is, it was accounting software, which did most of these things, even back as far long ago as 20, 30 years ago. Maybe not so much CRM, but even, what we know is accounting software could do basic inventory control, could do things like basic work orders and cost collection in the shop. But often what we hear is, and this is a direct quote from a client, said we felt like we never frosted the cake. And if you're like me and you get a sweet tooth, that cake, the dry cake without the frosting isn't so good. For example, the configure price quote area is often an area of severely underutilized software. Quoting and estimating is most commonly done in Excel and Outlook. Tools like a product configurator end up abandoned, never purchased. It was designated as a phase 2 item that we never got to. And just the management of pricing and contracts is woefully inadequate relative to perhaps what was expected. Another area that we find that is often severely underutilized is just engineering change control, managing revisions and rolling out new revisions and making sure that the organization does all of the things that need to be done, like quarantining old and obsolete inventory in response to an engineering change. Project management, often called jobs, but project management and project accounting is another area where we find tools that are readily available, but the engineering team or the accounting team decided to use Microsoft Project Standalone or decided to use Excel in lieu of tools that were integrated and would give them what they're asking for if they would just turn them on. And near and dear to my heart as a guy who's been APIX certified for 30 years and teaches APIX certification classes, it pains me at times to see the limited use of master production scheduling and MRP or capacity requirements planning, to see scheduling done in Excel instead of finite or infinite scheduling being used, and cycle counting not being turned on. So these are the areas that we see as difference makers, as well as some others that are often left on the sidelines. And I think this is based on these observations. If some of you are saying, hey, Scott, we've implemented all of these things and we're doing these, on this page and on this page, well, I would give you my hearty congratulations, respect, and say to you, hey, join me in doing the next part of the presentation, because our observations are that still many of these things like maintenance management, fixed asset accounting, integrated CRM are still woefully behind, and that tools to help smooth some of the processes and build links that email is being used to fulfill come from workflow management. And it's a tool that we've seen many companies are ready for, they can describe, but just aren't using. So this is what we tend to see, in that half of the companies that maybe aren't entirely satisfied with their ERP system. The reason is Microsoft Office is fulfilling a good part of it. So I'd just kind of ask you to do a self-assessment. Are you using Microsoft Office type tools for these things that is inherent in many ERP or CRM type systems? So those are kind of the things that we will observe. What we hear in terms of symptoms when the patient comes in and starts describing some of their pain are things like, well, we're doing things standalone and we have limited pipeline visibility. We're manually entering details into our sales orders that we think should be defaulting in from the product or the customer or whatever. We're delivering promise dates too slow to our customers. Our customers think we should be able to answer them while they're on the phone with us, and we have to go check with production. Or we're not able to meet our promise dates with the reliability that we'd want. We might have too much of some items in finished goods inventory and not enough of others. We're maintaining production schedules in Excel, and so we have to we're entering data in the ERP system about production completion, and then going over to Excel and re-entering it. We might have idle time one week and then overtime the next week. We may have too much of shortages, or we may have shortages of some components and materials, yet we're expediting others and have too much of others. Our inventory isn't trustworthy. We look at the system, it says we have 50, but we don't believe it, or we know that it's not accurate. Quality might have been left out of the loop. And while our ERP system offers quality modules or a bolt-on quality system, we decided to let the quality department do things in, you guessed it, Access or Excel. This one right here is one of my favorites because, again, it came from a client, and this was from a client CEO, and he said, the goal of this project is to make sure that our sales reps are not blindsided when they go in and visit a customer. And he said, he said, we know what the pipeline is. Our CRM is giving us that. He said, they don't know, they're blind to the things that are going on in the factory. Complaints, corrective actions, credits, returns, all of those kind of things. And that was, kind of the overriding goal of the project. And then from that distilled many requirements. So, we like to say that ERP implemented without RP is just an accounting system that is necessary. That's not to diminish it, but it's not sufficient. And that's why we tend to see that yielding a lower return on investment than was desired. So does it have to be this way? I had another client say to me, is ERP system just a Rubik's Cube that I can't solve? And so, we joke that ERP really means Excel replacement program. So we don't think that it has to be that way. And one of probably the number 2 takeaway from this discussion is that we would suggest to you any education that you've had on Six Sigma, continuous process improvement, Lean Six Sigma, whatever the school of thought is, almost all of it starts with being fact-based and data-based. And James Harrington in the book Business Process Improvement had a quote that we think applies to enterprise software. And the quote is, measurement is the first step that leads to control and eventually to improvement. If you can't measure something, you can't understand it. And if you can't understand it, you can't control it. And if you can't control it, you can't improve it. And so that's, if you really internalize that, all it's saying, and we all know this implicitly, why do we keep score when we play sports? So we know how we're doing relative to ourselves in games like golf. We know what our handicap is, or relative to our competition in, team sports. So, that's a key element here. A client of ours, a CEO, it illuminated this for us. As I said, I get some of my best thoughts from our clients. CEO of a Northeast Ohio manufacturer about 20 years ago, close to 20 years ago, said, I know if the machines that I invested in are being used. I walk the shop floor, I see them running, I see raw materials stacked up behind them. And this was what cinched it for us. He said, I receive machine utilization graphs and charts. And then he went on to say, and he used some curse words. He said, I don't know if people are using our ERP system. All I know is that the software vendor told me it would increase our turns from 2 to 4 or 6, and our turns have dropped to 1. And that's when the light went on for me close to 20 years ago, that the approach to asset utilization that we take to machines could be extended to ERP systems. And, if you go back 100 years to the Hawthorne studies, when, just simply illuminating a department within a manufacturing company, letting them know that you were watching them and measuring them led to improvement. It didn't even matter what you were measuring them on, just the fact that it was being measured, the folks in that department improved. And I think that study, the Hawthorne study, was over 100 years ago. So Larry, who was the CEO of that company, we decided to take him at heart and take what he said to heart. And we went through, we didn't use time as our denominator. And when we measured the effectiveness and the utilization of his ERP system, because time just means are people logged on. So what we said was, well, what could be the basis of excellence of using his ERP system that he was fearful they weren't using? And we said, well, that's features. Are they using the features that they should be using? And do these features exist? So in these areas, kind of subjects, this is a summary report. And this graph goes back, like I said, close to 20 years. We identified, working with them, 146 requirements. And we took a look at their system, and we found that 147 of them, and these were weighted, and we'll get into all that, but just for ease and brevity here, 107 of those 147 were available in the software, but they were only using 74 of them. So depending on which you want to use as your target, the 107 or the 146, they were using 73%, 74 out of 107 of what they could be using, but the software really only meets 51%, the 74 out of 146 of the capability. So you could look at this and say there was 33 features or capabilities that they could be using that they weren't, but they had a problem with 39 of them that the software just wouldn't do. And so that's where you're in the, do we upgrade, do we customize, or do we replace dilemma? In their particular case, they spent about 5 years turning on these 33, doing some customizations to close this gap between the 107 and the 146. And they did get that number up to in the 120s, but ultimately, as the goalposts kept getting moved by their customers and by their regulatory agencies and by their business model changes, they did ultimately replace their system. But they breathed 5 years of life into this system that heretofore they felt was not meeting their needs. This is another client that had a similar experience. But the fit of their software theoretically was 87%. I mean, that's a B plus if you're a student. But again, they were only using 54% if you take the 139 divided by the 259, and if you even if you say, well, what was really, use this as the denominator, they're still at a 62% utilization. And where I went to school, 62% was a D. So, we worked with them to help them elevate this level of utilization closer to the 225. This is my favorite example because this client had earmarked $600,000 for replacement of their ERP system. Company is the nation's second largest producer of sweet-dried cranberries, among other things. Craisins, if you know the Ocean Spray brand. And they were ready to replace it. They were ready to throw it out. They were so sick and tired of all the complaints. And what we found was that it could actually do 948 of the 1,124 items that we agreed with them and that they agreed with us they should be using, spread across these common features and functions common to a manufacturing company. So, but they were using less than half of what they could be using, 40%, 47% if you take the 445 divided by 948. And we suggested to them a re-implementation, an upgrade, purchase of some additional modules. They ended up spending only, and I air quotes around only, $150,000. Now, that's still a sizable chunk of money, but it's 75% less than what they were prepared for because they stuck with this system. And as of middle of last year, when I last talked to them, they had still been on this system for 9 years longer than they had anticipated. So, making better use of what they've got drove significant value because they had, I wouldn't call it cost savings, but significant cost avoidances. So how did we get to those numbers? I'm going to dive off of this now and give you a quick tour of how we get to some of this. Do an end show. We built a framework to capture this, but this is something that any company could do if it's a one-off. I'm just going to pick a company that we literally just finished up. It's a small, they shall remain nameless, but it's a small molder. Happen to run a system called IQMS, if any of you out there use it. And the scope for them was really focused on things like supply chain. So we looked at how they forecast future demand. We looked at their purchasing, receiving, and inventory sections. In inventory, we covered location control and some of the things like cycle counting. In manufacturing, we talked to them about their processes. So this would be your routings or methods. Some systems call them MRP. And in a few areas in terms of how they control materials and work orders. And we also did did a survey of their incoming quality. And then we also did cover their cost accounting functions in their general ledger and financial reporting. And just for the sake of brevity, I'll show you, let's take a quick look at, let's look at MRP for a moment here. So one of the subjects that they felt that they had was that they had too much inventory, in some cases, not enough of the right inventory, and felt that their planning, that their symptom-wise planning was not particularly good. And so as we surveyed the business with them and looked at how they do things, we determined that they should be including sales forecasts in their demand planning and as an input to classic textbook MRP. And they agreed with us. And so that we levied that as a requirement. We didn't weight it as a strategic requirement, but it was more important than a simple nice to have. We related it to our overriding goal of improving the material planning process. And there's a little note of why we need to do that. And then we took, so this was, we agreed with the client, what are the goalposts here? Do we need to be doing this? Yes, we do. Then we took a look at their current system. And this means the current version of the current system, the version they own. And we looked and found, yep, it does it, but they aren't using it. If they were using it, we'd have checked that box. So as you might imagine, this is not, while we've built a nice tool, this is something that anybody could do. It's a grid, it's a checkbox, it's an audit sheet, whatever it is that you would want to do. This is something that, a company could easily build on its own. It just happens to be the framework that we constructed for use with our clients. And so we walked the client, as you might see here, just in the area of demand sources for MRP, we've got 13 what we consider to be best practices that you ought to consider. Sales orders included in demand. Yep, we want to require that, but they don't have multiple warehouses, so things like transfer orders were not required. And so we walked through, observed their business, observed the business processes, walked the shop floor. We're all big disciples on our team of the going to Gemba from the Lean School. And once we were done capturing how important are the various features, are they using those features, and do those features exist in their current system, we run a scorecard. And we call it a single package fit gap. They really weren't interested in replacing their system, just wanted to, as we said, using Harrington, tell us whether the problem is the system or is it us or it's some combination thereof. And the scorecard, which should hopefully run in about 20 seconds, shows that this column, these are the subjects that we covered, if you remember from that tree. This is version 14 of IQMS. And we show that IQMS is a 92% fit to all of those requirements, version 14. Version 16, if they would do an upgrade, gets them a modest 1.6% increase in potential fit. But look at these red marks and yellow marks. They're using none of demand forecasting. They're only using half of what they agree they should be using in purchasing, 16% in inventory management, for a 42% overall score in the supply chain section. Manufacturing overall 31% utilization for a system that's a 99% fit. Cost accounting 17% utilization for a system that's an 80% fit. And so as you can see, the areas that they were doing well were income and quality, general ledger and financial reporting. The nice thing is they have their processes and bills of material and routing set up pretty well. You've got 85% utilization in product master data, which is where I know we have the bills of material. And this is where we have the routing data at an 89% utilization. So they've got the foundations in, even with the ledger, but just some of the transaction and the decision support capabilities just really need to be turned on, but they've got a more than adequate system to serve them. And so that's the next step. This is the before picture. This is the picture that we delivered to them just after Thanksgiving. And we'll hopefully be working with them to raise this level of utilization, to 75, 80, 90% here in 2021. So that's kind of the challenge. But again, going back to it, this method really derives from Harrington's approach that says, rather, measure your utilization in ERP. In machine terms, utilization uses a denominator and a numerator, or a unit of measure of time. How much time is that machine available? How much time were we actually running it? And that's obviously a number that companies are looking for and using direct machine monitoring to get these days. When it comes to ERP and CRM and related enterprise software, we don't think time is the right unit of measure, but we do think features, and then weighted features. How important are those features to you? Again, no magic here. We adopted the term strategic, required, and nice to have. High, medium, and low is sufficient, whatever, 1, 2, 3, whatever it is. But get that list of features, maybe go back and dust off the requirements document that you might have built 3, 5, 10 years ago when you bought your software, and use that as the basis, as your denominator, and then ask people through an audit of your processes, are we using those features, and does our system actually support those? Okay, so I'm going to flip back to the PowerPoint and kind of continue from here. So that's how we get to those numbers. So functionality gaps, that's what we saw, or utilization gaps, or not utilization, software effectiveness gaps. The software doesn't handle a feature that I need. So for IQMS, for that client, those features are, they were lacking somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 or 8% of those features. And by doing an upgrade, they were only going to get a modest level of improvement. So our advice to that client was, don't spend so much time worrying about whether you should upgrade unless you see that you've got some hardware risks, if the operating system is going to be a problem or something like that, but you're not going to get a significant leap in features. Let's work with what you've got and what you own. And so this might, some of those things that might have cropped up were, a discrete piece part system might lack formulation management. Distribution package might lack some of the manufacturing features. Ran into a company the other day that is running an old distribution system, and they're at least half of their business is manufacturing. And so now they, really probably ought to get a new system. Or it's just missing entire pieces that has led to workarounds, point solutions, manual processes. So how do we eliminate functionality gaps? Sometimes an upgrade will do it. Maybe the new version provides it. More often than not, companies already know that, and they run into a dead end. They still have some that an upgrade won't provide. So, there's ecosystems out there where independent software vendors or the software publisher themselves has some add-on modules. Some companies will write enhancements. Maybe they're partners of the software vendor that you can look to. Some of the well-known name brand software companies out there, the Microsofts, the NetSuites, whatever, they've got an army of third parties that are writing add-ons to plug holes. And it's a great source for improving the software's fit to your needs. And they're often not advertised by the software publisher. Other cases, maybe just a bolt-on interface. Integration between systems has gotten easier and easier today as systems have gotten more modern. And so, integrating or interfacing to a maintenance system or to a CRM system is not the arduous task that it used to be. In terms of automating people's days and automating things like sending out acknowledgements, workflow management tools, again, even if they don't come directly from your enterprise software publisher, can be great enhancements and that breathe life into what is a decaying system. There's a lot of controversy, and if we were having an interactive discussion, we could probably spend an hour on these next two. I'm a fan, and this is opinion, not fact. I am a fan of customizing as long as you do it within the system's tool set such that those customizations will go along the upgrade path. And so that's, another takeaway that I would leave you with, and that is before you customize, make darn sure that customization doesn't version lock you. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't, but that's something you want to go into eyes wide open. Doing something that would version lock you, which is most often hitting the source code, we view this as the second to last resort. If you can avoid that, avoid at all costs. And clearly the last resort is a replacement. Much as we do enjoy projects helping clients as a dating service or a shopper's assistant, we know that replacement is a long process, a disruptive process, and is most often not warranted. More often than not, you can squeeze some more juice out of the existing systems. Utilization gaps occur when companies are not using the available features. And as I showed you from the 4 case studies, we run into that more frequently than we do software fit gaps. Very often what we've seen, and this is from a client we're working with right now, depending on the perspective, but it was an accounting-led implementation. Now, the accountants say that they feel like operations and sales were let off the hook. The operations and sales folks feel that they weren't asked to be involved or lead. Irrespective of that civil war that we really don't want to get part of, the accounting implementation appears to be rock solid, but the rest of it appears to be limping along, and that's a active client that I'm engaged with right now. Excel is really tough to pull out of people's hands. It's like pulling a shotgun away from someone in Northeast Ohio or Northwest Pennsylvania. That's why we jokingly call ERP Excel replacement program. When left to their own devices, users will grab onto Excel. I think we all think in terms of rows and columns, and it's very easy to think in those terms for logs of quoting, doing calculations for estimating, doing production schedules, even tracking leads and opportunities in CRM. And what that does is it creates shelfware because you own these capabilities and they're sitting idle on a shelf. Oftentimes it's just a case where people aren't pursuing an inventory or an information sharing strategy, or will find a lack of knowledge. And it's not so much knowledge in training. The folks may have been taught what buttons to push, but it didn't sink in. Training without education typically doesn't get retained. So how do we eliminate utilization gaps? Sometimes it simply is illuminating that these features are available but idle, and that audit, like we did for sample company number 3, making them aware of what they own is all that really needs to be done. More often than not, though, part and parcel of that is the reason those features were left idle is because they weren't understood. Education is different than training in that education is providing knowledge and concepts and theory. And in order to be trained on something, you first got to have at least appreciation level education. I'm a big advocate of APEX. I believe that the IRC there in Northwest PA has done some APEX classes for people. You've got local community colleges and nearby universities that offer classes in supply chain or quality management, computer scientists, or other foundational elements. And these forums will help with the adoption and the utilization of the concepts and the tools embedded in enterprise software. But with all the education in the world, you still do need some hands-on training. Training provides job skills. It gets down to as simple as what buttons do I push? How do I navigate to that? How do I run that function? How often should I run that function? Where do I get to? And one of the things that the transitions we've seen over the last decade is this is not always expensive. It used to be, had to be instructor led. You'd pay for a consultant to come in. They charge you, $1,000 to $2,000 a day. These days, there's a lot of online coursework that might be embedded in the software, and even some online curriculums that you can manage so that you can make sure that people go through their requisite training. So this is a very good opportunity to plan what you want them to learn, and then maybe perhaps offer some incentives or rewards afterwards. This is, these days, one of the buzzwords of the last few years has been change management. And what is, to me, that's a nice glossy word that can be interpreted in many ways. But when it comes to utilizing enterprise software, change management means increasing adoption and utilization. What can we do to encourage people to work together inside the system and not go astray on their own volition, creating complex Excel models, doing things in Outlook that could be done inside the system, et cetera. Our view is, run a scorecard like you've done, like we've done for others there. Then make sure that the team and the people that are involved in the areas with low utilization have the requisite education. Then work through a design model and simulation exercise. Give them some time in a laboratory, like any other continuous improvement exercise. Charter them with, guys, we should be doing this inside our system. Go work together, dedicate, Monday afternoons and Thursday mornings to working through the kinks and how you could transition this out of Excel and into the ERP system. Build those documents and how people are doing it today and how they can and should be doing it. This goes back to that point about departing employees. Departing employees take with them the knowledge that they have unless you've documented your work procedures. I've seen some companies make it part of their quality system. That's a double-edged sword because now you can be audited on it, but it's not a bad way to go if you're willing to face that. So set up, construct, and prepare for it, and then train, deploy, and monitor. The monitoring is what we provide that framework for. Do a post-implementation audit. Go back through and make sure that people are using the features so that they know that what the expectations are. What this does is it eliminates the what's in it for me syndrome. And you have to be cognizant of that. Sometimes using the ERP system creates global optimums, but local pains. And sometimes people's jobs need to be changed around. You're shifting work from one department to another. And unless that is recognized, you will get some resistance. So that's why we're also big fans of building and utilizing process maps. And we'll cover that next week, just so that you can see where the work and the bubbles get moved. And so that you can avoid that. Because if you avoid the what's in it for me, you're more likely to increase your level of utilization and an adoption. Certainly some internal or external independent guidance can be utilized, but it doesn't have to be. From a leadership standpoint, our belief is where there's a will, there's a way. If you accept as a leader that people are doing scheduling in Excel, they'll do it in Excel. If you accept that communications are flowing through Outlook and not being stored inside the ERP system or the CRM system, they'll do it, because Microsoft Office packages are the easiest way to do things. And let's face it, we'll all pick the easiest way if allowed. If anybody remembers the book Re-Engineering the Corporation by Michael Hammer, he had a line in there that said, shoot your heroes. And I think it said something to the fact of heroes are the people who do things in the status quo that's suboptimal because they're really good at filling holes in the process. And sometimes they will resist it because they have made their reputation and made their bones because they're good at working in inefficient processes. So, I don't know that you want to use the word shoot literally, but Hammer's advice was to shoot those people who are so wedded to the status quo that they won't change. And you got to look for those. So, and I'll leave you with on the utilization gaps. Ann Landers and an old Harvard president, Derek Bach, have been both quoted with saying, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. And this one might be unfair to CFOs, but the idea is someone who's cost conscious asks his CEO, what happens if we invest in developing our people and then they leave us? And the CEO, she says, what happens if we don't and they stay? And I think that's a very quaint but effective way of looking at it, is the time that you invest in training and educating people will pay off even if some of them do lose. The last two gaps as we get towards the end here are bigger picture, more broadly. Structural gaps are when the software no longer broadly fits us. You go on an acquisition binge and you need multiple company and multi-company or intercompany processing. You acquire a plant, you build a second plant, you need inter-plant transfer processing. You decide to add a warehouse in Reno to serve the West Coast. And you need to do replenishment training and planning and transfer orders to outside warehouses. I've got some others on the next page, but our general theme here is that short and intermediate workarounds exist at best. You add a company or a trading partner or something in Korea, or you add a facility in Poland. And these are all real world examples that our clients have faced. You get a new and some of those complexities change your fiscal calendar, your chart of accounts, some very granular foundational level elements, or you decide that your costing method is no longer sufficient. Your business model changed and you need to go from actual to standard costing. These are features that you can't just customize or go to the software vendor and say, hey, we want a new costing method in the system. I would prescribe therapy before I would prescribe changing the costing method or having the vendor customize a new costing system or method into a system. And these structural gaps, most often than not, you're going to have workarounds with reports, maybe some tweaks, but you'll never really be happy. And ultimately, if you've got structural gaps, you just need to face the music that at some point you're going to need to do a replacement. The technology gaps will tend to be things like the system isn't keeping up with our changing needs. And that will tend to be things like external collaboration, reporting and information access is weak. We can't get data out of our system. We don't like the lack of graphical reporting. We're using Excel and Outlook instead of having the system work cooperatively in an interactive mode with Office products. Maybe, and this is a big one we've seen this year, frustration with remote connectivity or mobile options. Obviously with COVID, we've seen the men separated from the boys in that area. And some companies whose systems weren't natively mobile or natively remote ended up with very slow processing speeds. Again, same view on the technology gaps that we have on the structural gaps. The solutions tend to be stopgap. They'll solve the problem. They'll give you some room to move. They'll give you some breathing room, but there's not a lot that you can do. So what might you do? Maybe some web-based collaboration tools. Maybe you can port the data or the system to a modern database. We found for a client running an old Progress database, we found some ODBC drivers out on the, in the European market that were available. But I mean, these are really hard to find and hard to solve. So sometimes modernizing can help with increased adoption. So I think what I'll do is I'll leave it there today. See if there's in a couple of minutes remaining, if there's any Q&A, and if there are, I'll be happy to answer them. And then we'll start from slide here 41, which takes us is exactly at the halfway of the point of the slide deck. So Molly, do you have any questions in the chat box or the Q&A section?
We have not had any questions submitted, so I'll invite anyone that has a question to do that now. And while we're just waiting a minute to see if anyone comes through, I'll take the opportunity to thank you, Scott, for all of this information. We look forward to our next session on February 4th at 11. To everyone that joined us, thank you for your time. We appreciate it and look forward to seeing you again on the 4th.
Yep.
And I don't see any questions that have come through. So if anyone has anything and you want to reach out to, whoop, I spoke too soon. We had one come. Oh, someone just commented. Great job, Scott. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. Especially since this is a two-part, if there's anything that you feel like was missed or you would have covered in greater detail, I never leave things undetailed, so I'm hardly doubt that. But if there's anything you would have covered, shoot me an email. I'll be happy to do an email blast. If you can if you can't find me, you can find Molly and she can find me. Or if there's something that you want to make sure that is covered next in 2 weeks, I'd be happy to review that and incorporate it in the agenda. So, so thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you again on February 4th.